día volverá. Triste pena, ya déjalo ya.
To be honest, it seemed like a nightmare. Like I would go to sleep and think, maybe this is all some jacked up nightmare, and I'll just wake up and be in my bed.
Yeah, it is. It's Native American children that are being removed and placed in the psychiatric facilities, and then they're adopted out. They're alienated from their families. They age out, at age 18, and they have no family because they've been alienated from their blood relatives. They either become homeless or they go to prison. A lot of them are still a lifetime on these drugs. The state got money for these children if they could get them removed from the home. The state workers received incentives and bonuses for any child they could get removed from the home. It would be interesting. I do accounting work. I'd be interested to calculate what one child, what my son was worth to them.
We don't need prescription medication. We don't need an alternate living home or jail cell, as we call it, and all those other things. We didn't need any of that. I don't think it was just Patrick crying out for help. It was every kid in that system that was crying out for help, and nobody listened to us. Nobody cared.
When the state took him, he was drug-free. He was taking the vitamins that our doctor recommended. And when he died, he was on 5 drugs.
Hey, San Antonio, that was Patrick Redfeather. He's 15 years old. And this is what, as far as why I put on this armor for God and what they did to my son back in Cindy Taylor Crier Father's Day in 2009. And what has been, identified as a process here, and what we're trying to bring the awareness of. No, this has to end. This is a crime, And, where I've had to go, I tried to reach out to the people here in Texas on, why they wouldn't help my son, as far as he was defending the kids, they couldn't help him. The mod leader pushed the button on him. The 4 men pushed their way in and put my son in restraints and took him to isolation and told him he's not getting out, until the Prozac. That's what almost killed him. And then having to go, and try to understand as to why that lady on that Father's Day said to me that I didn't have any rights. Where do you have a right to do this to children? And then to find out that it's not just my son, and then to have to fight to and advocate, and what I've done here and try to continue doing as to what I brought you on the last show on, the processes of what's being done here, not humane, or just. So the Native American nations, and I'm calling together all nations and the indigenous tribes of the world to bring a healing here today. We need to start healing this process that's causing a mass incarceration here. The judge ruled this, and that's why I think I'm on the right path as far as trying to heal our children. And then in December 17th, the judge ruled that what we even said back during the 83rd session, when Governor Perry signed it, she said the same thing, that these psychotropic uses are making members not functional for society. And in 2013, when we did the restraints and isolation, Senator Vanderpute did take the language as far as, they put my son in restraints and isolation. And SB 1356 was signed on September 3rd, 2013. Former Governor Rick Perry signed that. And he also signed where in the foster care system that Texas was guilty of there, and the children were there, similar to what happened with Patrick. And what, as to why I've had to file on my son's matter, but not only my son's matter, on the children that I've had to work with. He signed HB 915 that said that psychotropics and the children were there. They were being put on these drugs in the foster care system in Texas. And this is like, the governor signed it, and I couldn't get anybody. And even today, when I reached out to our veterans, I mean, these are human beings that are enduring this for profit. And, to see that, this was done so long ago. And now for it to be identified, and that's why I need your help. And we're the ones, as far as going to make the change. The Native American Nations Council is asking to meet with Texas governor on the ESP project, but not just the ESP project. I keep thinking about this, and all these are children, but it's because of the work I did for my veterans that I can say what they're not saying in legislation. After we did that work in the 83rd, we came back in the 84th, and there was a report closer to home that we thought for sure at that time that someone would add our case study when we did here in the west side of San Antonio that showed the recidivism rate was the highest due to the psychotropics. And we went to Lisa Jarrett, advocate for the young man who killed his father. I mean, take your time and take Google and Google son kills father in San Antonio. This is part of all this violence that we're having these administrators of the system of justice here in Bexar County not acknowledged. And this was done under Susan Reed's tenure, but then when they did this to my son, and yet the judge ordered for you to bring the records. They put my son in restraint. They put him in isolation. Yes, it did end. The governor did sign that. But not to bring the records to help him. When I'm paying attorneys, but I'm disabled, and I'm a veteran, and being disabled has given me the blessing to be able to make sure, as to points of matter on not just the restraints and the isolation that the kids were enduring, but the psychotropics that this Prozac almost killed my son, and to see what, to have the fear of having to see what it did to Patrick. And what this young man is going to tell you, and who's defending our people's rights, and that I'm here to defend today on what, I've gone to the federal court now. And for the children of Texas, they're crying out. And I'm a veteran, and I'm a Native American also. So to try to bring a healing, I want you to listen to this young man, because he's going to identify what is crippling our society by destroying our children, as to what's been a process here. And it's going to change now, because it's brought to the identity. And I have it there on Cinco de Mayo, 2016, when I had gone to the federal court. The band showed up from Mexico, El Gatos Negro, and they were there to honor Father Hidalgo, as far as when the indigenous people rised up to defeat this genocide. And I think this is an awakening to bring the Native American nations together today to create a new course as far as our ESP project. But let you watch this young man here, and
The Department of Social Services makes up 53% of the entire budget for the state of South Dakota every year, right on the backs of the Native people. In 2000, all of a sudden there began to be this huge escalating problem of more and more and more children being taken by the State Department of Social Services. And so I went out and started asking different grandmothers and aunties and stuff all around through the state what was happening, why the kids were being taken. Of course, the people didn't know. All they knew was that it was happening, and that they didn't really have access to any of the kind of upper echelons of the government structures to figure out why they were doing this. So I ended up going over to meet with the chairman of the state legislative committee that has oversight jurisdiction over all the State Department of Social Services. I said to him, look, I'm getting all kinds of information from dozens and dozens of grandmothers that there's dozens and dozens and dozens of these children being taken every year. And he said, oh, a lot more than that. He said, yes, it's a virtual epidemic, he said. That was his term. It's a virtual epidemic. So I said, well, why is this happening? And he said, I don't know. He said, I don't know why. So I said, well, look, you're the chairman of the oversight committee here in the state legislature of South Dakota. You have a right to appoint an ombudsman to investigate this. And he said, oh, no. He said, that's an awful lot of money coming into this state every year. He said, that was his exact quote. And he said, this would have legal implications, and I'd have to get that cleared by the Attorney General. And so I figured he's just shining me on, right? He's just going to blow me off. But he goes over and he picks up the telephone and he calls over to the Attorney General's office. And he says, I'd like to leave a note for Attorney General Long, please. Tell him that it's Ted Clout over at the Audit and Oversight Committee. And I've got a lawyer in here asking about all them Indian kids. Within 15 minutes, the Attorney General of the state of South Dakota is standing in his office and starting to blather at me. And so I said, wait a second. If we all recognize that there's this epidemic going on, won't you agree to join with the chairman of the Oversight Committee to appoint an ombudsman to actually look into this? And he said, oh no. He says, that's an awful lot of money coming into this state every year. He said, and you'd have to sue us before we do anything like that. Well, that's, of course, music to my ears. And so I said, oh, please don't throw me in that briar patch. And so what we did is we began to go around and talk to our various people to see if it would be okay to set up an office there. Would the people be supportive of this? And they were, and we brought in Madonna Thunderhawk and Joe Cross and a bunch of the people that we knew to come in to be our staff. And so that we had this virtually all Dakota staff there working on this thing, carrying out the investigations. And then we began to discover these extraordinary things. This thing all started back when George W. Bush was the governor of Texas, back from 1996 to 2000, before he was put into the presidency in 2000. As the governor, he was the very first governor in the entire country to decide that he was going to establish as a condition precedent for any child being able to be put into the Texas state foster care system that they had to get a mental health screening test that is completely culturally warped, completely biased against the children. And it turns out that when Native American children are given this test, 98% of the children will flunk this test and be found to be special needs children. And the state of Texas discovered that they could get up to $79,000 every year for a special needs child, as long as the child remained in the foster care system and wasn't sent back to their families. And so they set up this algorithm starting all the way out with Ritalin and working its way all the way up through what were they? Prozac, Zyprexa, and they had this whole algorithm for the kids. Well, this one doesn't seem to be changing their attitude. I mean, these people are still acting like Indians. And so he comes into Washington, D.C., and one of the very first things that he did was he appointed a hand-picked blue ribbon committee to ask them to determine whether or not he should set up a condition on any of the federal funds going out to any state under the Adoption and Safe Families Act, that they had to implement the Texas Mental Health Algorithm Project in their state. And they surprisingly recommended that he do that. At his inauguration, it turns out that his good friend, Bill Janklow, who was the assistant attorney general of the state of South Dakota, who called in the Nixon administration people at the Wounded Knee occupation. He got invited to come to the inauguration in 2001, January 2001. And while he's in Washington, D.C., he sits down and has a meeting with George W. Bush and his friends, who then explain to him the bonanza that he has in the state of South Dakota. Don't you realize what you're sitting on there? You're sitting on a gold mine where you can, in fact, for every Lakota child you can get your hands on, you can designate them as special needs kids and get $79,000 per kid every single year. You keep them in the system, and you can give part of that money to the pharmaceutical corporations, who will in turn, they'll give contributions to the Republican Party. It turns out 742 Native children every single year were being taken away from their mothers, from their entire Lakota family, from their entire Tioshbai, from their tribe, from their entire Native culture, and placed in white foster care settings. And they've also sponsored a bill which now authorizes them to do protocols on Native children to determine, you know, what type of effects these type of pharmaceutical drugs have, which, as it turns out, coincidentally, they're not allowed to give to children under the age of 18. And the head of the Child Protection Division of the South Dakota Department of Social Services, whose name is Regina Weisler, is signing these things for these children to allow them to give those doses to those children. And the children are drooling on their shirt, cutting themselves, getting suicidal, you know, all of the exact symptoms that were publicly identified by the Food and Drug Administration as to why you cannot give these particular pharmaceuticals to children under the age of 18. These people are profound and fundamentally racist. That is the key engine that motivates these people. That we're dealing with the Caucasian race. That these people are fundamental, intense dialecticians, and that they derive their entire sense of being and value from opposing some other. They live in terror. They're deeply alienated. They take great pride in their intellect, and that they've alienated themselves from any type of organic relationship with the universe, with the earth, with the natural processes of the planet, and they view the Aboriginal people as being an absolute fundamental threat to them. And that is why they want to try to extinguish the people. And that the Native people, and among them the Lakota, as we know, that there's a certain reputation that the Lakota have, a certain reputation the Oglala have there, that has to be organized among themselves to bring that to the fore and to reestablish the Ocheti Sekawan, Wiyate, the 7 council fires of the Lakota people, and to have this template established of taking control back from the states, to stop them from taking their children away, to make the federal government transfer funds to them as reparations for what's been done to them, to provide for the training and the assistance that the people need. And it's important to remember that the Oglala spiritual leaders of Nacha will tell you that they know that the Wachich's culture is going to collapse, that it cannot continue the way that it is, that they are fouling their own nest constantly, and that they're going to destroy themselves. And so the people, the Native people, have to start to move now to reestablish their sense of self-sufficiency and to be able to stand alone, so that when in fact the white culture collapses, they will be able to provide for themselves and their children. And it's a deep and abiding spiritual belief that the people have. And one might say that the objective data supports that pretty seriously right now.
You know, he and what he said there is the God's truth, and this needs to be identified, and there needs to be what you know, the working of what we did with the restraints and isolation here in Texas, and you know, what the governor doing that, and what the judge ruled a cease and desist, you know, and I'm going to send my prayer because September 25th, they had a riot in Giddings, Texas. And I got down there, the kids were on the roof, but this place was surrounded. I mean, they had DPS, they had it's a war zone. The kids are on the roof, they tore the place up. I mean, you can go online, I think it's September 25th, 2015. But, you know, that's what we kept trying to tell them. You guys are using these psychotropics on these kids, and you're causing the violence, you know. Then they have a peer-to-peer. They're locked up together, but they want them to tell on each other. And this is our justice system that, you know, we have these people that are calling themselves legislators that are trying to justify. Well, you can't justify a crime. Or I think the judge said, you know, what this process is creating is not functional for society, being a crime against humanity then. Their children. So if we haven't all this identified, and this is Texas that's sort of leading the charge here because, you know, it was initiated first here in Texas, and now you know that. And it's not going to continue, not if the USA is to prosper. And that's why it's time for the Native American nations of this land, as far as to bring the healing. We have a holistic ways, and, you know, that's sort of what we have with the ESP project and what we're asking the governor to meet with us to bring in what is happening or what we're in fear of maybe happening. You know, one of the young ladies' son that I have attached to the psychotropic and restraints and solitary confinement is causing suicide. In the federal court is Sarah. And, you know, she's similar to Mary Jane, another Native American. That's, and I'm praying that the governor gives her back her son. You know, they took this mentally retarded child without acknowledging his mental capacity. And she had taken the records and had it there, but, you know, the way the system works, any way they can get him on these antidepressants, so he ended up in the juvenile, put on psychotropics, and the short time that he did get out, because he spent 3 years in isolation, and they did a documentary on him. And, you know, yesterday she called me, and she's scared he might commit suicide. They moved him to the psych ward last night. And, you know, the damages that are done, but then not to get any help or not even to think that, you know, I don't know if it was similar, but he does have, and she had all the records, but every attorney has to where, like my attorney, wouldn't get the records to get him into where you're going to help him. We have a justice system that we're supposed to be rehabilitating but helping. But if you're the one that's guilty of doing this to children as a process of justice, which is what seems like, you know, when that was the highest rate here, it was Senator Menendez. I took my case study to with the Casey Foundation for the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative, and he did not want to take that language to protect those children on the west side of San Antonio whose minds were being altered. That was very, very specific on that. 70% of them, that man killed his father, and yet he's not going to say that. And then when the decision with the judge, I see him going to Sister Chavez March, and I asked him, well, what's the decision now? Can you do something? Can you ask the governor to cease and desist the use of these psychotropics? Because it's showing it's a crime. That's what the judge ruled. But, you know, after that riot in Giddings, I thought, you know, some of the families reached out to Mary Jane's Texas Families of Incarcerated Youth, and they're charging the children with inciting a riot. And so we wanted to find out, how do we get protection or put a shield over them? As far as, you know, my promise here on the day they chemically altered my son, and that director for over there from Cindy Taylor Cryer said I didn't have any rights. You know, I promised then to wear this armor and shield until I eradicate, you know, the uses of restraints and isolation, psychotropics. And restraints and isolation are gone, and, you know, we're on this mission for a reason. December, I had reached out to Senator John Whitmire's office, and I had asked his legislative director, to where I've tried to get the case study, everybody interim, to Lawrence Coleman, and he wouldn't take it. And yet, when I asked him about the kids and getting the records of the kids being on psychotropics and Giddings, said, how do you expect us to control them? And this is going to be the course change, because we're going to come together today, and this petition is going out to ask that we do a cease and desist. January 26th of this year, 2016, President Barack Hussein Obama ended solitary confinement in the juvenile facilities in the United States. If I can't get Texas Governor Greg Abbott to hold to his word, as he had sent in his communique on March 25th, 2015, to Commissioner Specia, as to this not being a process for Texas children under the umbrella of the care of Texas. Well, it is a process, sir. And if you are a true man of God and you do believe that it can be a new course in America, then meet with the Native American Nations Council to adopt the ESP project, the Earth and Solar Poly Affordable Housing Project, where our veterans mentor these kids into a work program. As to what I did in school, I built a cabinet for my mother when I was 14 years old. Let's put America back to work and end the suicide in America by using our holistic approach. Native Americans are using sweat lodges to cure veterans today from PTSD. The damage to what you've done to these children with psychotropics. We're asking to take our Sweetgrass Project suicide prevention resource into the Texas prisons and bring our holistic way of the hemp oil to end this anxiety that has been caused by the damage of psychotropics. God bless you.
Think it makes sense to lock so many people alone in tiny cells for 23 hours a day for months, sometimes for years at a time? That is not going to make us safer. That's not going to make us stronger. And if those individuals are ultimately released, how are they ever going to adapt?
sé que un día volverá. Triste pena, ya dejemos ya. Yo sé que un día volverá.